Today is going to be a topic video, and I'm going to respond to a question that I get really often from parents, which is, how do I help my gender questioning teenager think more critically about her beliefs and her identity? And we're going to discuss today several important things related to this issue. So I'm going to describe what critical thinking is. We're going to talk about the backfire effect, which is a type of cognitive bias. And we're going to talk about critical thinking in terms of adolescent development and what that means. We're also going to discuss some practical ways that you can encourage critical thinking in non-gender related areas of life, and also discuss some issues that have similar features to ROGD, such as other kind of identity issues, how social media impacts our sense of self, mental well-being, and how using those examples might help your child to develop some wisdom about their gender identity beliefs. And we're also going to talk about some of the tricks and strategies in how to have difficult conversations that come from the realm of like political conversation that apply more to adults, but there are some interesting tips there that might help you have these conversations with your kids. Okay, so critical thinking, let's talk about what that means. The definition of critical thinking is using objective analysis and evaluations to make a judgment and make a decision. So it might seem like we adults are always very good at critical thinking and that all of the beliefs we hold are somehow empirically validated and really logical, but actually that's not true. So Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist who studies how we develop morality and how we make decisions. He's also the co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind, and he wrote a really good book called The Righteous Mind. I read this a couple of years ago, and it really was an eye-opener because he explains the way research shows that we all have intuitive gut reactions to things, and that we make our decisions really based on emotion, and then afterwards we selectively decide what information to believe in order to justify our beliefs. So your children are not the only ones doing this. I think this is even more heightened in teenagehood, but we all do this. And so if you're a reader and you enjoyed The Coddling of the American Mind, I highly recommend checking out The Righteous Mind. It's a really good book. And I'll also include in the show notes a little summary of the book if you don't have time to read the whole thing. So I want to talk now about a really important cognitive bias called the backfire effect. Now, the backfire effect basically means that when people have a really strongly held belief about something and they are presented with facts and information that contradict their beliefs, not only do they reject the facts and they reject the information, but they often double down on the belief that they held in the first place. So this is really baffling, and it doesn't make a lot of sense if we are hyper-rational people, but again, we're not. We make decisions, as Jonathan Haidt reminds us, based on our emotions first, and then we cherry pick information that validates what we believe. So I'm going to briefly talk about this backfire effect and what causes it to happen, and then later on some ways that we can reduce the backfire effect in others. Like I said, this is a cognitive bias, and it's actually related to the confirmation bias. You guys might have heard of confirmation bias, basically that we selectively pay attention to information that confirms the beliefs we already held. So this is really similar, but this includes the act of doubling down on the false belief. So it's interesting because the backfire effect is applicable especially in two cases. One, pseudoscientific beliefs. So beliefs that sound like they're real science but actually aren't. And also beliefs that have to do with your sense of personal identity, ideology, or feeling like you're a good person. So it's interesting that gender identity kind of tinkers with both of those areas. So on one hand, a lot of the most ardent and radical activists are trying to say that there's no such thing as two biological sexes. It sounds scientific because they point to intersex conditions and people with anomalies in their kind of makeup, biological makeup. And if you're not paying close attention, you might think that that argument is sound, but when you really apply the scientific method, of course, it turns out not to be true. So if you are a parent who is new to this whole question about gender identity and you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. It's not that important for the purposes of this video. But for those of you who are veterans, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. So pseudoscientific beliefs are susceptible to the backfire effect, and beliefs related to self-concept and identity. So as we know, teenage exploration of identity is a very normal part of adolescent development, which we'll talk about later. So, questioning your gender really taps into both of these things. So it's really tricky and it's very prone to the backfire effect. So what happens in the backfire effect is that when that closely held belief is challenged, the person feels threatened, and then they have to defend their beliefs. Now, in other videos I've said, it's almost like when you're backed into a corner, the only strategy you have left is to attack. And so when kids feel really backed into a corner by the conversations they're having with their parents, or, this has a lot to do with the relationship, I'll talk about that later, the person who is defensive needs to actually go through in their mind and recall all of the information that they've learned that originally led them to that belief. So in the case of gender, your kid's probably going back and thinking about what they learned on YouTube or what they learned on Instagram or what that trans influencer said. And so it actually ends up reinforcing those beliefs that they had from before. So that's one of the ways it works. And secondly, when we are challenged with a personally held belief, not only do we have to recall information that supports our belief, but we actually have to come up with new reasons to hold on to our belief. So this could be reflected in the way that kids rewrite their history. You might notice that when a kid first comes out, they have either totally rewritten their childhood to say, even when I was a little kid, I was really uncomfortable with my gender. Meanwhile, the parent is like, no, you weren't. Like, I was there. You weren't uncomfortable with your gender. Or sometimes kids come out and say, I'm only interested in exploring pronouns. I don't want to medically transition. I promise I'm just kind of exploring. And then within a few months, they're starting to make more and more demands. So it's kind of like an upping the ante situation here. Those might be two examples of how this shows up with gender. So they recall the old information and they come up with new information to try and justify those beliefs. So the good news is there are ways to reduce the backfire effect. So the first is to model kind of like open, curious, loving, and engaging tone when you talk to your kids. So of course, if you're hostile or uncivil, that is going to induce the backfire effect because it's defensiveness, right? So if you engage in a tone that is open and curious, that helps reduce the backfire effect. Also, of course, telling somebody that they're wrong can trigger the backfire effect. So explicitly saying, this is crazy, I don't know how you believe this, or kind of critiques like that can induce the backfire effect. And another suggestion made by some researchers is try to present the information in a different way. So like just one very small example of this is if you want your kid to watch a detransitioner, let's say. There's a lot of reasons this is very tricky and depends on the situation, but let's just say that's something you're going for. If you say, oh my gosh, this kid is exactly like you. I think this is exactly what you're going through, and I just know you're going to regret transition if you do it. That is likely to induce a lot of defensiveness. However, if you say, I know you've been questioning your gender, and I've been trying to learn as much as I can about it. I saw a video that may not be exactly what you're going through, but there are some similarities. I'm wondering if you'll take a look and maybe see if you can relate to anything the person says. So that's a much more neutral tone in the way you approach the conversation or the way you try to present the information. Now, I want to caveat this by saying the information that I'm drawing from here was originally studied in how adults have difficult conversations in which they have a belief that is contradicted by facts. Now, you're in a different position because you are the parent of a child, and it's very much within your purview and actually your responsibility as a parent to correct your child. Kids don't know everything yet. They don't have wisdom yet. So it's the parent's job sometimes to actually challenge their child or give them information that is correct or explain to them why a belief they hold maybe doesn't make sense. Now, in authoritative parenting, which I talk about in my introduction series, there has to be kind of a balance between expectations and guidance, and also dialogue and being interested in what your kid has to say. So it's not to say that you're just going to drill away at your kid, but I want you to remember, as we talk about the backfire effect here, that there are times when parents do have to provide their kid with information that contradicts the kid's beliefs, and that is okay. I think this applies most for families who feel very, very stuck and cannot have a productive conversation around the topic of gender. And productive doesn't necessarily mean that your kid has a light bulb moment and changes their mind. Productive means that there's a conversation, maybe there's some tension, but then the relationship is still intact. There's hugs afterwards. There's maybe even like tears of like, Mom, I love you. I just want you to listen to me. Like, that might be a productive conversation in and of itself. So I think that if you feel like every time we talk about gender, things just dissolve and we don't talk for days and things have gotten really rough and she like refuses to talk to me, using these types of strategies might be helpful to just kind of take some of the edge off. Now, if that's the case, I definitely recommend going to the other videos that I've made on attachment and how to think about the kind of roadmap of what to do. Getting kids off screens, reconnecting, bonding, enjoying one another's company, and helping to broaden the kids' world are the #1 priority. But this is specifically about how to encourage critical thinking around the topic of gender. In terms of development, our ability to think critically is not fully developed till our mid-20s. So that means that if you have a kid who's not in their mid-20s, they're not going to be able to think critically to the same capacity that they will when they're older. So that just means you need to have some realistic expectations about how much critical thinking they can do. Doesn't mean that you give up on the prospect, but it is a matter of understanding that when your kid seems to be like not processing the consequences, let's say, of a medical transition, or they say, no, I know I'm not going to want to have kids and I know this will make me happy. It's not their fault. They cannot possibly understand those things because their brain is not fully developed yet. So you have to kind of read between the lines when kids make statements about things. Doesn't necessarily mean that they will feel that way in the long term. And even if you tell them you may not feel that way in the long term, they may not get it, okay? So we have to remember that they're still developing these skills. It's worth noting, like we talked about earlier, that adolescents are supposed to be developing a new sense of self. So going from childhood into adolescence, it's very common and appropriate for kids to redefine themselves in a way that's quite different from how they were as a kid. They're trying to grow out of that like baby stage and become a new person. So gender identity exploration may be fitting into that developmental need, which makes it even more prone to the backfire effect because it's a question of personal identity and ideology. So that's really important to note. And another thing I have to say is that these beliefs that we're talking about, for most of the families I've worked with so far, my suspicion is that these are not beliefs that are endogenous or coming from the child alone. These are not organic and spontaneous beliefs. These are beliefs that have been developed more likely than not from hours and hours and hours of like listening to trans YouTubers and looking at trans Instagram and meeting other trans kids at school who spend hours talking about these concepts of identity and transition. So when you have a strongly held belief that is also somewhat indoctrinated into you, it's very challenging to have those kinds of discussions because when parents, for example, say, I tried to ask my son, why does he feel like he's a girl? He couldn't answer because he doesn't really know, because he's been swept up into something that isn't really coming from the inside of him. Now, that may not be the case all the time, but more often than not in the families I've worked with, these kids don't really know exactly why they feel this way. And that you hear these kind of scripted phrases, I just know I'll feel better. I just can't explain it, but I know something is wrong. And when you hear that as a parent, you have to sift through a little bit, like, Which of this is kind of truly coming from the child, and which of this is part of the indoctrination? Now, I want to caveat this caveat by saying it's not that their feelings aren't real. They are very much struggling. But the way they're struggling has very much been molded, in my opinion, by all of the belief systems that they have now adopted.